Hello, my name is Natalie Ayers. I'm a second-year master's student in computational analysis and public policy at the Harris School of Public Policy here, and I'm happy to welcome you to today's discussion, the Kremlin's power play, what's next for Ukraine. Over the last few weeks, the Russian buildup of troops around Ukraine and the failure of talks to de-escalate the situation have caused increasing concern to the US and its Western allies. On Friday, the Biden administration warned an invasion may be imminent, and a call between Putin and Biden on Saturday seems to have accomplished little. The US and many other countries are urging their citizens to evacuate Ukraine, while Russia continues to deny any plans to invade. Amid this uncertainty, we're here to discuss what's driving the conflict, where it may be headed, and whether diplomacy still has a role to play. To tackle these questions, I'm very happy to introduce our distinguished panel of experts. Ivo Daalder is the president of the Chicago Council on Global Affairs and served as the US ambassador to NATO from 2009 to 2013. He has also been a senior fellow at the Brookings Institution as a specialist in American foreign policy, European security and transatlantic relations, and national security affairs. Susan Glasser is a staff writer at The New Yorker, though her career has spanned multiple publications, including serving as founding editor of Politico magazine and as the Washington Post's co-bureau chief in Moscow for 4 years. Together with her husband, she also wrote Kremlin Rising, Vladimir Putin's Russia and the End of Revolution. Michael McFaul is the director at the Freeman Spogli Institute for International Studies at Stanford and a professor in their Department of Political Science, where he studies American foreign policy and great power relations. Dr. McFaul previously served for 5 years in the Obama administration, first in the National Security Council and then as a US ambassador to the Russian Federation. Finally, our moderator today will be Biana Golodriga, a senior global affairs analyst for CNN with expertise in financial news and Russian political affairs. Thank you all for joining us.
Thank you, Natalie. Welcome, everybody. And I'm delighted to be moderating this panel with very familiar faces. Unfortunately, I wish we had better news to cover, but I feel like I have you on the air quite frequently. Michael, you work for a different network or you contribute to a different network. Otherwise, we'd have you on all the time as well. So, Michael, let me just start with you, because I'm curious to get your take as to where things stand, some 72 hours after we had that really ominous press briefing from Jake Sullivan Friday, warning that Russia could strike anytime within the next week or so. Obviously, many people had been looking towards the end of the Olympics as a time frame there, and he laid out US intel suggesting that it could happen before the end of the Olympics with no specific date, but clearly that's not a typical briefing that we get from the National Security Advisor, particularly on a Friday. So if you could take us from Friday to where things are today, when we saw that very well orchestrated, highly produced video of President Putin at yet another lengthy table with Sergei Lavrov, foreign minister, and a prepared question asking Lavrov if there's still road towards diplomacy and if talks can continue and be fruitful. And Lavrov suggested that there was an opening there. So if you could sort of give us both, counter what you saw Friday with where things stand today. Are you more at ease about possible de-escalation here, or do you think that we are still headed towards the path of war?
Well, first, great to be here with such a great, fantastic group. And Biana, I didn't know you were the moderator. I thought you were one of the panelists. I thought Axelrod was moderating. So you should jump in with your own views and what you know, because I follow what you say very closely and really appreciate it. Just my take of the last 72 hours, my reading of what happened on Friday, and, I used to work with a lot of these people, and Ivo did too, who are in the government today, that they had not obviously, my reading of tea leaves is that they had received some new intelligence that suggested perhaps, you can't intercept Putin, right? He's too clever for that. It's hard to intercept his communications, but others are not. And when it gets down into the system, we have some capabilities to do that. And my sense was that they saw something in that traffic, that intel traffic, SIGINT, right, signals intelligence, that led them to believe that invasion was imminent and still is imminent. And you're absolutely right. The National Security Advisor does not give a briefing like he did on Friday. Most certainly never happened when I worked at the White House. So, you know, they have now taken they've asked all Americans to leave. Our charge d'affaires, Christina Kvien, who is the de facto ambassador in Ukraine at the moment, from what I've been hearing, just talking to people this morning, she is physically moving to Lviv right now, right? So those are pretty dramatic actions that suggest that they still feel like military intervention, invasion is imminent. At the same time, I've dealt with Vladimir Putin, been in the room with him for 5 years. I've actually been at one of those tables that you were joking about, the Macron table, not the one with Lavrov today. Actually, the one with Lavrov, I know where that is too. They're both in the Kremlin. I've been at both of them. One time with Secretary Kerry, one time with our former National Security Advisor, Tom Donilon. But we had other people around the table, by the way, not just the distance there. But joking aside, I've written about Putin for 20 years. I met him in 1991. I've written books about him. And I want to say definitively that I do not know if Putin has made a decision. And I don't trust anybody who thinks they do know, because that's the way Putin likes it. Remember, he doesn't meet with a lot of people. That's the first photo I've seen with him and Lavrov in this entire crisis, by the way. He most of the time sits out at his compound. He doesn't come to work. He sits out there. People come to him. He doesn't confer with a lot of people. And most certainly the people he confers with are exactly the people that don't have any interaction with journalists, let alone Western journalists or ambassadors, right? So I just think we need to be humble in what we know about his decision-making or not. And we don't know what, if he does decide to invade, between doing nothing and a full-scale military invasion, occupation of Ukraine, there's a lot of choices in between. And I just, we can come back to that, but I think there's a lot of things he might do that would be short of a full-scale invasion, but also would be catastrophic for Ukraine, and I hope catastrophic for Russia as well, particularly with respect to what the West has promised will do in the event of an invasion.
Yeah, and Susan, I want to bring you in because Michael is absolutely right. It's these past few years, the reason he was so low at that long table is because he's taken extreme COVID precautions and sort of has isolated himself for the past 2 years and surrounded himself with basically just his siloviki, right? His security leaders there, 2 or 3 men that he speaks with on a constant basis. I think this was the first time he'd met with Lavrov in a while, at least publicly. Given that, and given how long you have followed Putin, I keep coming back to this question because it stands out to me. Yes, he's a man that everyone has known that follows him for 20 years now. I think he's on his 5th US president, but I keep hearing this phrase that this is a different Putin perhaps than even the Putin that we saw in 2014 when he went into Crimea. And that in terms of trying to analyze or rationalize, with him or give him an off-ramp, maybe that much more difficult now, given how isolated he has been, given how perhaps set in his own ways he is, and determined that he's found a path to really move away from any possible integration or cooperation with the West. I'm curious to get your take on that, and if you agree, what that means for the next weeks or months ahead.
Well, thank you so much, Brianna, and thanks. Much of what I know about Russia comes from talking with Mike McFall, so I'm delighted to be here with him. And my perspective on this as well does go back really to the very beginning of Putin's tenure, which was the period of time when I was in Russia. I was at the first meeting, actually, that Vladimir Putin had with Western correspondents in 2001, immediately after his famous summit with George W. Bush, when they looked into each other's eyes. And, we know how that worked out. But that's actually a sort of circuitous way of answering your question, because I would say that, clearly this has been a period of extreme isolation for Putin. And it tells you a lot, by the way, that, the first thing he does is, after 2 years of this, is to fly to Beijing to meet in person with Xi Jinping, who also has been very isolated. And I think that's a very notable and striking and concerning fact. But I would also say that there are through lines here that are interesting and important to understand, right? Like the listening to Vladimir Putin the other day when President Macron came to visit him, and he had this extremely contentious exchange with the French journalists who were there. And it was very reminiscent to me, actually, of early Vladimir Putin 2 decades ago. Remember that Putin came to power through war. And I think this is very important. War is not some impossible, inconceivable, over-the-top possibility for Vladimir Putin. He's launched wars again and again. They have resounded to his political benefit and also helped to shore up his regime and his ability to stay in power. And actually the war in Chechnya was the reason in many ways that Putin was able to become the elected president of Russia in 2000. So I think that's very important for people to understand. Same thing with the Siloviki. That's the term, Bianna and I, use as a shorthand, but that's the term for the men of power, essentially fellow veterans of the security services and the KGB, like Vladimir Putin. Vladimir Putin is, in some ways, right, like one of the last serving relics of the Soviet era, serving, in such a powerful position. And I think there's a through line throughout. Somebody said to me the other day, and I think it's interesting to consider, that Vladimir Putin is an incrementalist who does very bold things. And I think, if you had said 20 years ago, or even 15 years ago, or 10 years ago, well, Vladimir Putin is going to send an invasion force of 130,000 or 70,000 people to the borders of Ukraine, and this is where we're at, and he's demanding, his unconditional demand to the West is that they should literally roll back time, and pretend that the Cold War didn't end the way that it did, pretend the Soviet Union didn't collapse the way that it did, and undo the membership of democratic independent countries who chose to join NATO, that's his condition for not invading his neighbor. You both wouldn't have believed it, and yet it seems not even all that shocking that we are where we are, because he's already invaded Ukraine before. He's already invaded Georgia before. He's already prosecuted a very brutal war inside his own borders before. So at any rate, I think that like Mike, don't trust anybody who says they know exactly what is in his head. But it's actually not inconceivable that we are where we are. And I think if the US government and the National Security Advisor say that war is imminent, it doesn't mean it's going to happen in some all or nothing way, right? That the choices between, World War III hellhole or everything will be just fine. We're in a new place with Putin, regardless of, whether and how and if the tanks actually roll across the border in this kind of war movie scenario.
Ivo, let me bring you in, because what we constantly hear, look at some of these, as Mike said, some of the players now in the Biden administration, his advisors, are the same people who were there in 2014 after the invasion and annexation of Crimea. And many would come out of it saying that they've learned a lot of lessons since then, and that the sanctions and the repercussions that Putin faced were clearly not dire enough and not severe enough to prevent him from doing so again. And that lessons learned, here we are today. And one of the tactics that we're seeing, as we talked about Jake Sullivan coming out Friday with that press briefing, is the US, and really an unprecedented, at least recent, history, and again, to prevent a war, right? Releasing as much information and as much intelligence as possible, along with our British counterparts. I'm curious, again, because I'm not going to even preface this by saying what is Putin thinking, but in terms of throwing off his game, or at least prolonging perhaps the inevitable, do you think that has been productive so far, coming out front, being very transparent, and releasing as much intel about what Russia may or may not be doing, and false flags operation, et cetera?
Well, thanks, Bianna, for the question, and really so happy to be here with all of you. I learn, like everyone, I learn from everyone on this on the Zoom here every day at Twitter and everywhere else. So thanks for all what you're doing. A set of really complicated questions in terms of what did the team that is really returning back to power learn from 2014. One thing they didn't learn is that it's very hard to deter or even affect the behavior of Vladimir Putin under the best of circumstances. But it's really hard when you take a major deterrent step away, which is we have made explicit since day one, as did Barack Obama, that we will not defend Ukraine if it's attacked, which, by the way, is not much debated in Washington, and sort of taken as self-evident. But it may not be self-evident, in the sense that if the rules-based system that we are so proud of and think is now at stake, as Tony Blinken said in his Berlin speech, and as Biden repeatedly has said, changing borders by force is one way in which that rule-based system is being attacked. And under different circumstances, in 1990, when that happened, when Iraq invaded Kuwait, the United States mobilized the world to reverse that invasion. We had 500,000 troops in the Gulf, US, UK. We had a French division, et cetera. So just as to talk about how one needs to affect the calculation of Putin, we've taken a very big stick away. I'm not saying that we should have deployed the stick, but we need to be realistic about that. So that what are you left with? You're really left with the steps that the administration has put forward. One is, by all accounts, they have done a very significant and good job of uniting the Europeans, the Canadians, the Brits, and the US government behind a very serious set of sanctions. And they have, I think, let it shine through how serious those sanctions are. I don't think they're sufficient to deter or affect the calculus of Vladimir Putin, but we'll see. The second thing they have done is they have put really NATO together in a very in a remarkably successful way. This is not an alliance. Anybody who's spent any time there, as I have, that is easy to have speak with one voice, and yet in this case they have. However, sometimes discordant it may sound. The reality is it is united, and I think it will stay united. We've put some troops not only on alert, but also moved them forward, and so have other NATO allies. And then we've used information warfare, Bjana, that to your question. And I think it's been a very deliberate attempt. One, to try to remind the Europeans that what we're seeing is something we haven't seen since 1945. A massive mobilization of armaments by the largest military power in Europe. And to think that this has all gone away, or that you can just fly in and have a conversation with Putin and it will be all fine, we're trying to counter that. So it is meant as a messaging to the Europeans, but it's also trying to undermine Putin's and his capacity for defense. There's some couple of interesting instances. Diana, your network reported not that long ago that there was unhappiness in the Russian military with Putin and the plan, and they were a little worried about what was going on. And some have taken that to mean that we need more time to prepare. Remember, we were thinking this was coming in January when we first heard the intelligence. We're now into late February, mid to late February. So they took another month to prepare. And I think the options that were on the table, just the military says we need more. That was one indication. Second indication is with Jake Sullivan going out and the president saying what he's saying, you now have Putin perhaps doing counter disinformation, which is, well, maybe there is a diplomatic way, and having Lavrov saying, there's an option here, which I take as yet more preparation for attack that I do think is likely to come, though, like Michael and Susan, we will only know if and when anything happens, and even if it doesn't happen, we won't know why it doesn't happen. This is complicated. I want to make one last point because I do think that we traditionally lack sufficient imagination to understand what others may be capable of, and I think Susan and Mike have both spoken to that. I'm increasingly sensing that this is no longer just about Ukraine and NATO membership, or even controlling Ukraine and its democratic destiny. I'm no longer thinking that it's about reversing sort of the revising the Cold War European security arrangement, which he sees as Russia / the Soviet Union having lost. I think it is also about, and the trip that Putin took to Beijing underscored it, to really challenge the American-dominated system. And he's trying to do all three at the same time. And he's seeing as this being a particularly good time. The West is weak, it's divided. He has successfully been able to take much of the right wing in Europe and indeed in the United States under his wings. Russia, Putin is a distraction at best. That sometimes many people are taking the side of this guy in the United States and in Europe. And I think the challenge is that big. It's not about really Ukraine. It's not really about the post-Cold War European security system. I think it's about fundamentally who's going to have the say in what happens in the global system, us versus Beijing and Russia. And we need to take it as seriously as that.
It's interesting, Michael, because you hear Ivo, and he is sort of repeating a lot of the foreign policy agendas and initiatives that President Biden and even candidate Biden was laying out, that the next challenges will be between autocracies and the West and democracies. But he was really focused on China. And his meeting with Putin last summer, was more along the lines of, let's get on a stable and predictable relationship. Hopefully we can close that chapter and move on to China. And China seems to have been dragged in here at this point. We don't see any more potential last minute summits between President Xi and Putin, because we know Xi and China and their foreign policy in particular are really risk averse in terms of encroaching on other nations as well and their autonomy. And they do have a good relationship with Ukraine. I'm just curious to get your response here as to whether the Biden administration, when talking about dealing with autocracies, had factored in Russia being, at least his first year in, his biggest headache, his biggest foe right now.
Well, first, I want to completely associate myself with one thing that Susan said, everything that Susan and Eva said, but two things I want to underscore. One, the piece that Susan said about war, I think is really important for our listeners to understand. Putin has gone to war, Chechnya, Georgia, Ukraine, and from his perspective, he won all those wars. I would add Syria to the list, by the way, Susan. He feels like he used military power very successfully to prop up his ally in Syria. So from his perspective, the use of military force has been successful in achieving his objectives. And we should not underestimate that. There's so much of this like, oh, he's got to save face, cost benefit analysis. What about Sberbank's, stock price next week? Maybe I'm revealing some of the people I interact with that last comment, but he sees that those have been successful to him, and he doesn't have to worry about losing face from anybody inside Russia. The second thing, to Ivo's very important point, I think it's a fundamentally important point, that this is not just about Ukraine. Those bigger agendas are most certainly what Putin is about today. On this, I would say, I think Susan's right. Some things are similar. Some things have changed with Putin. As a follower of him for a long time, that, being anti-democratic and using force, he's been that way since 2001 and before. But I think this bigger mission is something new. He wants to right the wrongs, as Ivo said, of the post-Cold War order that he thinks were unjust, not unlike lots of German leaders after Versailles. He wants to stop NATO from expanding as if it was expanding. Yes, of course. Although he didn't always, by the way. That's the point I want to keep underscoring. That our debate about NATO in particular, and I shouldn't say this in front of our former NATO ambassador, but that is a variable that changes. That is not some constant in Russian foreign policy. And because I see Ivo here and David Axelrod, I would just remind people to go back and look at what President Medvedev said at the NATO summit that we were all at in Lisbon. 180 degrees different than what Putin's saying today. And yet that was after the 2 rounds of NATO expansion. But this bigger thing, I think, is real. I would add one more piece to Ivo's list. Putin is obsessed with uniting what he believes is one Slavic nation. Now, I'm reporting here and explaining. Obviously, I don't agree with him, but that is something he's become increasingly obsessed with. He's written about it. You don't have to believe me. It's all in English on his website. Go see what he says about Ukraine. Could not be clearer that he doesn't believe that Ukraine is a real country. So that's part of his, one on the steps along the way. But this bigger thing, autocrats versus Democrats, I could not agree more. And to answer your question, Bianna, I think the Biden administration made a mistake when they thought that this was just all about China and stable and predictable relationship in Europe so that we can forget about them and focus over here. It'd be nice if other countries would just agree with things we want to focus on. But tragically, other countries, other leaders get a vote, right? The Taliban got a vote last summer. Putin gets a vote. And I think that was an analytic mistake. I just actually mailed a book on Monday called Autocrats versus Democrats, looking at China, Russia, and the United States today, lessons from the Cold War. And the main point of the book is, I think we obsess so much about the Chinese economy being this giant power factor, which it is, and it's very complicated, and I don't want to diminish it in any shape or form, but we leave out Russian power. Eva already mentioned it. Russia's got the largest military in Europe, period. And it's way more modern today than it was 20 years ago. Same with its nuclear forces, same with its cyber forces. So on power, it's, there's two big powers and then there's this third power, but that third power is on the other side. It's on the China side. And then on the ideological thing, I do believe this demands way more attention. Xi Jinping has an alternative model, but it's mostly attractive in the developing world. And by the way, not even that attractive. Does anybody remember a revolution in support of Marxism, Leninism, Maoism in the last 30 years? People demanding on the streets? No. But the thing that Ivo was alluding to, Putinism, where multilateralism, nationalist, populist, orthodox values. And by the way, Xi Jinpingism has no purchase in the developed world, right? Maybe some folks up at Berkeley, I'm a Stanford guy, maybe up at Berkeley, there's a bunch of people talking about that's a model for America. I haven't heard of them. It's mostly for the developing world. It's mostly for the South. Putinism is focused on the developed world. And tragically, he's had some wins ideologically, as Ivo talked about, and the combination of Putin and Xi with this illiberal, anti-democratic, dual track, I think demands a lot more attention from our strategic planners. And we don't have the luxury of just saying, well, we're just going to focus on China and Taiwan. I think we have to focus on both of these challenges together. And my sense is, I'm curious what Ivo thinks, because he interacts with these folks a lot more than I do. But my sense is that the administration has begun to understand that. But I could be wrong. I'd be curious what the ambassador says.
Ivo?
So I just jumping on the Biden piece and how the administration is looking at it. And I think, I was struck, as I think most people weren't, because I don't think they paid attention, in the last big interview that Biden did before the election, with Norah O'Donnell, different network, but we're not on a network here anyway, with Norah O'Donnell, in which she asked him, what's the biggest threat to the United States? Oh, he said, the biggest threat is Russia. And he said, the biggest competition comes from China. And I've always thought that was exactly the right way to look at it. And everything that I know about Biden, when he was vice president, he was very focused on Russia. And after the vice president, first article he wrote after vice president was an article in about Russia in Foreign Affairs. He gave a speech at the Chicago Council about a year ago. It was all about Russia. It wasn't about China. He's always focused on it. And so I think the administration, as Michael rightly says, has lost that thread, pivoted to China, this idea that you could have a stable and predictable alliance with Putin's Russia in 2021. I mean, who came up with that idea? Particularly Putin, as Susan and Mike said, who's so confident now and yet so isolated from alternative sources of information. As Carl Bildt, former prime minister and foreign minister, of Sweden said he spent the last 2 years completely isolated, only talking to people who agree with him, and reading really bad Russian history to the Slavic point. And so, yeah, I think they now realize that you can't ignore Putin. I do think the president also has this autocracy versus democracy framework, which he laid out at the Munich Security Conference a year ago in his first big foreign policy speech, in which Russia did reappear as a potential threat to be worried about. I just think they thought it was all going to be about China, and now they realize it's actually about a bigger thing, and they need to reset, and they're in the middle of that reset. By the way, they haven't talked a lot about China in the last few months, which is a problem in and of itself when you think about it, even if Blinken was in the region just the last week, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I asked the U.S. ambassador to the UN last week. I had her on, and I asked her if, the administration behind closed channels, what have you, is talking with China about how perhaps, trying to persuade Putin in ways that Western leaders can't. And she said she's, talking to her counterpart every day on that very thing. And we heard Jake Sullivan say that on Friday that China won't be able to compensate, for all of the sanctions and punishment that Russia would receive if they do in fact invade. But Susan, I want to go back to, we'll take about 5 or 10 more minutes here, and then we'll open up to student questions. But you wrote an email, you wrote a tweet over the weekend that really, caught my eye. And it does seem like everything we're describing here is a real tectonic shift in geopolitics and a 5-alarm fire with, over 100,000 troops surrounding Ukraine, an invasion perhaps imminent. And you noted that you don't see mass protests in Western capitals. We're still seeing this sort of shuttle diplomacy. We have the German chancellor, the new chancellor in Kyiv today and flying to Moscow tomorrow, won't even say Nord Stream 2 sanctions publicly. It does seem like we're talking about two different levels of crisis at this point, and that while it's great that NATO and the alliance is somewhat united, there do seem to be different levels of I would say, urgency to the situation. Talk more about that.
Yeah, I mean, this is really an important point, Viana, and it's interesting to hear Ivo mention Saddam's invasion of Kuwait, and a principle that was seen as so sacrosanct, the forceful revision of borders, that George H.W. Bush was able to rally an enormous international coalition to push that back, and that seems like such a. And by the way, interestingly enough, it was actually the Soviets who agreed with the United States. This is a kind of a key moment at the end, signaling the official end of the Cold War. It was the Soviet foreign minister who actually released an amazing joint statement with the American Secretary of State, Jim Baker, condemning Saddam's invasion and suggesting that we were in a kind of new world. Well, you could argue that this crisis is the end of that world, to the extent that it really existed. And of course, you could say that was 2014 when Putin illegally annexed Crimea and essentially executed a forceful changing of international borders in Europe, and that this is all a result of that, or perhaps of the failure of the West and of the United States to more effectively respond to that crisis and all the other crises that have led up to it, right? That my point about Putin being an incrementalist who has ended up doing big things, and step by step, right? He's been able to do these things. So right now, though, on your point about I was just really struck this weekend by the lack of mobilization. Putin has this odd constellation and echo chamber of amplifiers on both the far left and the far right, not just in the United States, but also in Europe. And, we've seen this for a long time. It's been fascinating to watch in this crisis. Crises reveal a lot, not necessarily about Putin so much as about those reacting to Putin. And so he's courted for a long time the far right. You've seen Donald Trump and his amplifiers like Tucker Carlson, from one conservative vantage point, or radical right vantage point, I would say is more accurate rather than conservative, defending Putin. And then you have, on the left, interestingly, where the George W. Bush invasion of Iraq in 2003 remains, an incredibly sort of touchstone moment in terms of their foreign policy views here inside the United States. And yet you've seen a lot of influential foreign policy voices there essentially arguing that people, I suppose, like everyone on this event, that Mike McFaul or Ivo Dollar is some kind of pro-war hawk for saying that, actually Putin is lying when he says that this is all about NATO and expansion, and that somehow the United States can just placate, the big Russian bear and he'll go home. And it's really been, I think, a fascinating debate to watch. And I do think that's one of the reasons why you don't see thousands of people in the streets protesting this. I mean, let's just be clear that we don't know what's going to happen. But if this force of 150,000 Russians attacks Ukraine and invades, a lot of people are going to die. This is an act of whatever you want to call it, neo-imperialism. This will be an act of a former Russian empire seeking to regain by force its territory. It is against every kind of international law. It is against every kind of morality. It is against anything that anybody who stands for human rights should be for. Just to be clear about that, because I feel like that often gets lost, to be honest, in a lot of conversation about somehow why it's, like Mike and Ivo's fault that, in 2009, we didn't, stop Ukraine's dreams of joining NATO.
And there's nothing really even to fault Ukraine with it in terms of trying to understand where Vladimir Putin's coming. I mean, Ukraine has done nothing. And my final question is on that point, Michael, and then we'll open it up to students' questions. There was some bewilderment, and you would hear from administration and officials in the United States that they were frustrated with the passivity you could describe from the Ukraine and Kyiv and Zelensky and his administration. On the one hand, you're hearing ominous warnings in the United States and people are scurrying out of the country. Zelensky, sort of saying nothing to see here. We're not getting this information. And, we've been at war for 8 years, nothing new here. But I'm curious to get your thoughts on this approach, because, even today, he said Wednesday, the 16th, which is the day that the United States said Russia may or may not invade. Now it's going to be a public holiday in Ukraine. And our reporters there on the ground are sort of, giving a sense of business as usual among Ukrainians. And I'm curious to get your thoughts on the rationale behind that. Is this, a smart tactic from the Ukrainians trying not to provoke at all the Kremlin, especially knowing that this isn't something that they just have to keep on doing for the next year or so before there's an election in Russia that's a real serious election, right? A legitimate election. Putin's going to be there for the rest of his life, however long he wants to. And this is an enemy and a neighbor that they're going to have to be dealing with for many years to come.
Yeah, it's a great, hard question. Before I get to it, I just really want to underscore something Susan said. If you go back to February 2003, millions of people in Europe and in the United States were protesting what they thought was an unjust preemptive war. Now, we don't need to debate whether it was right or wrong. Saddam Hussein was a dictator who killed his own people, and there's no equivalence between Iraq then and democratic Ukraine today. But it is really striking to me that the anti-war protesters in this country, and it seems, as I follow episodically in Europe, are spending way more time criticizing President Biden for trying to prevent war than they are from criticizing President Putin. And I think we need to take a deep look at why is that happening? What has happened to the arguments that Susan was just making? And it's on the left and the right in our country for sure. And it is really striking to me. And it's also striking, Bianna, to Ukrainians. I was just right before this call, I was on a call with about 55, 60 Ukrainians. Here at Stanford, the institute I run, we have a pretty major training program with Ukrainian leaders over the last 15 years. So it was a meeting of our alumni. So now these people are in government, in business, in Lviv, Kiev, the East, all over the place. We actually hosted Zelensky last August, just now that I think about it, here at Stanford as well. And two things that were striking in that conversation. One, they just cannot understand why there aren't these protests. Why to them, this is clear as day what's happening. There's 130,000 plus soldiers about to invade their country for no reason. There's nothing that happened, unless I missed the secret cable. Brussels didn't change their policy. Biden didn't change theirs. Zelensky was rebuffed when he came to Washington in terms of what he wanted to do with NATO. And yet we're all debating NATO expansion and looking for the transcripts of the Gorbachev meeting with Baker. And they just don't understand it. They asked me, Professor, help me understand what has happened to your country. And I think that I'm just reporting that's how it feels in their country as they're about to be invaded. We're debating, NATO expansion from 30 years ago. But to your question, I would say a couple of things. One, on Zelensky, you as to my journalist friends here, you might not be surprised that politicians might say one thing when they're on TV and think something else privately. That's actually not a Ukrainian thing. That's a public official thing. And he obviously does not want to have bank runs. He does not want to have people fleeing the country. By the way, there is evidence that those things are happening. I just heard from people, banks running out of money. That is already happening. People are moving to Lviv. That I just literally heard from a dozen families where they have moved their families to the western part. He's trying to keep calm. I think privately, they're very worried. Privately, my Ukrainian friends are very worried. And Zelensky faces a really big political challenge. If Putin does attack, there's tragically that Zelensky, tragically, I'll let them run their politics their own way, but you can imagine one of two things happening. One is all the opposition rallies around the flag and says, we've been attacked, we need to support our president. In the phone call I just did with 50 very prominent civil society leaders in Ukraine, they were split right down the middle. Half of them saying, yes, we'll rally behind the president, and the other half saying, no, there will be real criticism of the president that he did not take more measures to prepare our country. And I just want to underscore, this is exactly what Putin wants, right? He wants Ukrainian society to be divided. He wants Zelensky to fall. He wants democracy in Ukraine to fail. So he's achieving that objective already by the pressure he's putting on, and in particular, the economic pressure on Ukraine already, from what I'm hearing, has been profound, and that's already achieving some of Putin's objectives.
Yeah, to your point, I mean, there's just a headline now that the U.S. is considering up to $1 billion worth of loan to help Ukraine right now, given how dire the situation is quickly becoming, and we're temporarily, I think, removing the U.S. Embassy there as well, further west. Let me get to a student's question. It's from Dominic, and I'll give it to you, Eva, whoever wants to answer it. If Putin invades, again, we can't read his mind, but will he try to sack Kiev and install a puppet regime?
I mean, that's I think, no, we don't know. We don't even know, as the intelligence community and our administration keeps on saying, whether he has made a decision on what to do and how he and what he's going to do when he's there. What we do know is we can look at the forces that are arrayed and where they are and what kind of capabilities are. I'm not a military expert, but I play one on TV. No, what I hear is that he's really got setting himself up for three different options. One is to cut off the half of the Ukrainian military that is arrayed against his and other forces in the east, in the Donbass region, and that they would envelop those forces from the south and the north, and sort of cut them off and kill the army. I remember in Colin Powell's talking about the Gulf War famous phrase: first we're going to envelop it, and then we're going to kill it. So that's option number one. Option number two is that they would at the same time move to Kyiv, and they can do it very quickly, particularly from the north and Belarus, and these forces that are training right now are some 60 kilometers away. They'd have to go through the Chernobyl exclusion zone, but the Chernobyl exclusion zone is forest, and it's not, the radiation levels are extraordinarily low, not a problem if they want to go through that. And either surround Kyiv until a new government is installed, or whatever negotiation comes about. And the third is that they, which is similarly to the second option, is basically they take all of Ukraine east of the Dnieper River, which kind of cuts Ukraine in half. Very few people think it's going to be all of Ukraine, which is why so many people are moving west to Lviv and other places. All of these are really big military operations with large numbers of people involved, airplanes, artillery, rocket fire, with casualties in the tens of thousands. By the way, including Russian casualties, something that may or may not, in the end, affect his calculation. But that's really what we're talking about. Now, there are other issues. There's cyber. There are other kinds of attacks. But this idea that it's some minor incursion, you don't have 150,000 troops with this level of capability, with tents, with hospitals, with blood banks, at the level that they have. If you're going to use it just a little bit. Again, we don't know. That's the capability he has. Smart planning says that's what you focus on.
Yeah, I have to say, it was a bit jarring. Yesterday, I was at my son's soccer tournament, which is like a 7-day tournament, which is a story in and of itself, 7-hour tournament story in and of itself. But I was listening to Russian media and, the few independent networks that are still there. There was like a 15-minute conversation on the possibility of maritime warfare sort of spiraling out of control between Russia and the West, and obviously in the United States, and then nuclear warfare. And it was really frightening to just hear experts talk about things at that level. And gives a real sense as to the many options that Russia does have to attack, given what they're doing in the Black Sea there. Let's go to a question from Ambika Khanna, who will ask her question live on video.
Hi, panelists. My name is Ambika Khanna. I'm from UChicago studying policy at the Harris School. My question was primarily on your take on, in this race for global dominance, what's your view on the potential power of a trilateral between Russia, China, and Iran, given their prowess respectively in military supply chain, and oil? Thank you.
Who wants to take that?
That's for Mike.
Well, okay, I'll go first. Ambika, that the book I mailed on Monday originally had China, Russia, and Iran in it, versus the United States. It also had Europe in it, Ivo, just so you know. And my editor, this is a commercial book, not an academic book, made me take out Iran and made me take out Europe as an independent actor in this global fight. Whether those are good decisions or not, I'm just telling you because that's the way I frame it. And most certainly, in the fight between autocrats and Democrats, those three countries that you mentioned are aligned. It's complicated though. It's not simple. And both China and Russia, at the same time that they are have close relations with Iran, are also trying to develop close relations with other countries in the Middle East, other autocracies in particular, that have a more confrontational relationship with Iran. And I think great power competition in the Middle East is going to be a big, important part of the 21st century, without question. I do think, I'll stop on that. I can go deeper if you want, but I think it's part of the equation. The last thing I will say is, because I'm this book, I'm looking at lessons from the Cold War, right? For how we deal with this. The cautionary tale from the Cold War is we made some mistakes in the Cold War when we treated all communists and all national liberation movements alike. That's the tragedy of Vietnam, from my view. That's the tragedy of, supporting people like Jonas Savimbi in Angola, in the 80s when he said he was a Democrat fighting a Marxist-Leninist regime. And I think a smart strategy from the United States in the 21st century has to disaggregate different kinds of autocracies and be sensitive to the fact that they don't all have the same interests.
I have to say, this sort of reminds me, I can't wait to read your book, Mike. I don't know when you have time to write, but it benefits all of us. I was thinking of Admiral Stavridis' book too. It's 2034, and it talks about the battle between China, Russia as a player there, but China really in the US and Iran too. Let's go to Tex's question, Tex Dozier. Thoughts on potential sanctions as a response and tool, specifically cutting off the gas, Nord Stream 2, and the impact on Russia internally, as well as on Europe's reliance. Seems Germany's best case would be to temporarily hold on Nord Stream 2, but German political appetite and energy reality, such as nuclear phase out, only tolerating short-term actions, sees contradicting Biden and Schultz statements last week at that press conference. There had been a lot of focus on that and the different messages coming out of the United States and Germany. United States saying Nord Stream 2 categorically is dead if Russia invades. Not so much from Germany, using it as strategic ambiguity, I think was the phrase Schultz used. Susan, Ivo, anybody want to weigh in on that and the leverage that may or may not have?
Well, I think that, again, this is part of the Russian playbook going back to Soviet times, and Putin has adeptly used it. Anything to divide the allies, in particular, Germany has emerged as a sort of a weak link in this crisis. And, Putin even has his own bought and paid for former German Chancellor Gerhard Schroeder, who is a member of the board of Gazprom, paid handsomely for his work on behalf of Russia. The transition from Angela Merkel, I think, can't be understated. In fact, it may be one of the precipitating reasons why is this crisis happening now, because I think a lot of people are wondering that, even people who focus intensively on the region and understanding. I think what Mike said is so important for everybody to remember here. Nobody did anything except Putin. There was no movement on the part of NATO. This is an artificial crisis made up by Vladimir Putin on a timetable of his own making. We can look and we can try to divine what some of those reasons might be. One big thing is that Angela Merkel, who's been the main interlocutor between Putin and the West for some number of years, she grew up in the former East Germany, spoke Russian fluently, was always trying to find a balance, and yet she was the one with Barack Obama who ultimately actually crafted the sanctions that have still been in place as a result of Putin's 2014 takeover. So the fact that she's left the stage, this new coalition government, they haven't handled it well. They don't seem to know what their policy is. Olaf Scholz is now actually in Ukraine and meeting with Zelensky today, on his way to see Putin tomorrow in Moscow. Nord Stream 2 has been an embarrassment. And frankly, part of the problem, again, is that Putin, at every step along the way, there's been a lack of willpower to really take the steps that might have stopped him from getting to this point where we're at right now. And I think there are a lot of reasons, and people need to look and examine it. They're not doing that. European energy independence has been blah, blah, blah talked about here in Washington. I can tell you, as soon as we returned from our 4 years in Moscow in 2004, 2005, blah, 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 blah. There's been a U.S. envoy at the State Department whose job it is full time to work on European energy independence from Russia for a decade and a half. Guess what? Hasn't succeeded. Nord Stream 2 pipeline has been opposed by the Obama administration, the Trump administration, the Biden administration, and yet it's more than 90% complete. And Germany's our closest, ally supposedly in Europe. So, Europeans have handed, a lot of the leverage to Vladimir Putin. And that's a power that he has. The other thing to consider that, I think we in the foreign policy and national security world, sometimes we don't take into account, the domestic politics as much as we should have, and I was, reality check on yesterday morning with a bunch of political reporters who pointed out, well, they were talking to their sources in the Biden White House, definitely not Mike and Ivo, our sources in the Biden White House, and their sources said, damn, not to be crass about this, but we really don't want energy prices going up anymore this spring. We're already in a world of trouble when it comes to inflation and the midterm election. So again, let's, I leave you with that thought.
Can I just add just a small thing, because I think it's so important, and we've emphasized it in different ways. We lack the imagination, or we don't know the history well enough to understand that we still live in a world in which one political leader can decide to go to war, and war is not something you do against drugs or poverty or whatever. We're talking about shooting people and killing them in large numbers of organized mass violence. And most Europeans, this is where I come from, that's just not part of how they think. And as a result, they're not willing to consider the steps that they would have taken, on energy being the obvious one. This is a problem that could have been solved decades ago. But it just wasn't worth it, because, he's not going to invade. Like, that's not going to happen. And we now live in an era where we really need to understand that is, in fact, what may well happen, not only in Ukraine, but it may happen in other places, because as Mike said, he thinks not only that war is a good thing, but that he can win them. And he has demonstrated a willingness to do so, and to think that he can get away with it. Why not one more time, or two more times, or three more times?
Yeah, it was damning to see Putin. I think, was it last week and then the week before, speaking before, first it was Italian business leaders and German business leaders, as well, as if it was business as usual. And this goes back to the point made earlier, that there doesn't seem to be much outrage or more fear that a major sovereign country could once again be invaded for no reason by Russia. Let me get to another question, and that is,
Bianna, one footnote, historical footnote, can I add?
Yeah.
Our current Secretary of State, I think he's only published one book in his life. It's called Ally versus Ally, America, Europe, and the Siberian Pipeline Crisis, published in 1987. So to underscore that we've been dealing with this issue for a long time, our own Secretary Blinken published a book on that topic.
Yeah, and here we are all these years later. I would just add, really, just because I think students should know this, those, who in Russia support Putin or don't, there are a few independent pollsters and surveys that we in the West follow. But the most recent one showed, A, that his popularity has gone up over the past few months, and B, while the majority of Russians, and understandably, do not want war, they would argue and they would support Russia as the aggrieved party in their view, and not the West, and not NATO. And that's an example of how Putin has been able to monopolize state media, right, and really crack down on independent media. And you see the propaganda machine really working in full effect. So anybody who worried that, well, what is he going to have to account for at home, doesn't seem that he's, that concerned about that. I think we have time for one more question, and this is from Kevin. And Kevin is asking, is there knowledge of what actions different actors within the U.S. executive branch, such as the National Security Council, Department of Defense, Joint Chiefs of Staff, and Department of State, will support or push for if and when Russia invades Ukraine, and how that might influence decisions made by the president? Susan, you want to take that?
Sure. I'm not sure what it means by, sort of want and push for, but just to, I think more broadly, it is interesting that this is an administration that has been dealing with this for a long time. Vice President Biden actually had the portfolio of dealing with, Ukraine and the other sort of countries on the periphery of Russia, Georgia, at the beginning of the Obama administration, and reassuring them actually about the reset with Russia, and that the United States was not going to forget about their interests. And so he has a long experience in this. Tony Blinken, as Mike pointed out, has been thinking about this a long time, but they're also shaped by, I think it was traumatic in 2014, right, Mike, to have this Russian invasion of Ukraine and the takeover of Crimea. That was an embarrassment. It was a surprise. And the question of, what, if anything, could have been done, both to not just know about it, but to head it off in a more strong way. There was a lot of talk, we all remember at that time, about off-ramps that we were offering Putin. And, Vladimir Putin, if I've learned anything, it's that he has no interest in roads that are built by Washington for the purpose of, getting him to take an exit. And, yet some of that persists. So if this actually happens, what they have said, and I have no reason to doubt it, Jake Sullivan, the National Security Advisor, has said, we are talking about going right to the very top of the, escalation ladder here in terms of sanctions. We're not going to, scale up. We're going to go right with big, massive sectoral sanctions. I think the worry is what happens if it's something less than either all-out war or all-out peace. And I think that's where you increasingly see a level of concern is, has the administration fully thought through as much how to get Europeans on board for things, attacks by Russia that fall more in a ambiguous line, more assertive attacks, say in Eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass, where there already has been a conflict for a number of years, stepped up cyber attacks, that kind of thing. And we don't have consensus, it seems to me, on that. And there will be real fault lines within this administration on the inside, as well as in our politics more broadly. The Democratic Party is no more united, it seems to me, than the Republican Party, to be honest, in how it wants to approach this real test of, the kind of post-unipolar American moment. I think that's what it is. It's a test of what kind of world order we're going to have in a world where the US is not the only superpower. And I don't think we have answered the questions for ourselves about the nature and kind of American power we seek to project in the world going forward, unfortunately.
I'd add just really quickly, the one potential problem that the administration has is that everyone very much comes from the same tradition. They have the same experiences. They come from it in the same way. They've been engaged in it a very, very long time. The key people are, in fact, very close to the president himself, have staffed him for a long period of time. And so it isn't that there isn't good debate and discussion. It's a question of how many real differences there are. This ain't no team of rivals, to put it that way. This is very much a team that works very well together. They know each other. They like each other. And sometimes in policymaking, you need some disruptors. You need people who are willing to ask some big questions. I'm not sure we have that. I think it will come if Susan rightly says if what we do isn't clear. But that is the possibility of groupthink is the one thing to worry about. And I hope they're spending a lot of time thinking about how do you push alternatives? How do you do red team thinking? How do you think differently in order to make sure you've crossed all the T's and dotted all the I's?
Yeah, can I jump in for 1 second or not? I know we're over time, but maybe there's too much groupthink among this group because I keep agreeing with everything, but not everybody agrees with us. So just 3 quick points. First, yes, Biden was the point person, as Susan said. I traveled with the vice president to Georgia, Ukraine, and Moldova because that was his portfolio. I also was in the first meeting that he had with Putin when he was prime minister and the vice president was, we were there in March of 2011. So he's sensitive to that. But the second thing I would say about him and with the people around him is my sense is they think they have a good sense of what Xi Jinping is doing in the world and kind of the way he calculates. I don't feel that when they're talking about Putin. And I think that it makes them nervous precisely because of the points that my colleagues were making, that Putin is capable of doing radical things that they're unpredictable, and he doesn't think like us, and that's right, and that makes the president feel nervous and his team, and they're nervous about other things. Like, remember, we've had a lot of times on the eve of war, just like we're on now, hopefully not, but maybe yes, when leaders promised us small little wars that we'd be in and out, they'd be successful, and it'd be over by the summertime. And we know how that happened, right? Either prolonged wars or wars that get bigger. And I think there's a genuine fear within the administration about those unintended consequences, things that happen that drag this to make it bigger, and rightly so. But the last thing, I just really want to agree with what Ivo just said at the end. When and if we get through this short-term crisis, I think the administration does need a radical rethink of how they've been approaching Russia and Europe. My colleague here at Stanford, he died just recently, George Shultz. He was the Secretary of State for Ronald Reagan. You always use this phrase. He called them Pershing moments. That's when they put the Pershing missiles into Europe. And we don't have time to debate whether that was wise or not. I thought it was not wise at the time, but the metaphor is a good one. He said, we wanted to change the dynamic of defense in US-Soviet relations. We wanted to shake it up so that they were responding to us and understanding that we were credible about changing these dynamics. And I think that's a really useful metaphor if we get there for how the West, generally speaking, the democratic world, generally speaking, needs to think about how to deal with Putin's Russia, because the strategy so far of defense, of which I was a part of, I want to mea culpa too, has not been working.
Let's just end on, I just have to say before we wrap up here that one battle Putin is at least winning in the short run is that of talking about Navalny, right? Because people have shifted focus away, and understandably, to the bigger issue at hand, and that is perhaps another invasion of Ukraine. But I appreciate Michael Fall and Susan and Ivo and all of those keep reminding of the human rights abuses that are going on right now inside Russia, and Navalny's plight as well, like Ukraine for no reason. He is behind bars, and that's something that we need to keep revisiting as well. This has been a fantastic, if not depressing, conversation. I will do something very Soviet right now and wish everyone a happy Valentine's Day on this ominous note. Hopefully get some happiness in your day today and enjoy it. And I hope everyone learned a lot. I know I did. I always do when I listen to these smart voices. So thank you so much, Michael McFall, Susan Glasser, Eva Daldo, and obviously David and everyone there at the University of Chicago. Thank you for including us today.
Thank you all. Great conversation. Bye-bye.